My guest this evening is David Sprintzen. He's an author, he's a professor of philosophy at C.W. Post, he is chairman of the Long Island Progressive Coalition, and much more. Welcome, David, to Art Scene. It's a pleasure to have you here. I welcome you on all scores.
Thank you very much.
And I thought maybe we would focus on your book, Camus, A Critical Examination, and then let the other issues in your life come in and out as they will, and I'm sure that they will.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
I was very touched by something that you wrote in a letter to me when we talked about your being on the show. And you said, I'm going to quote you, "Camus' thought has been my constant companion for more than 25 years and has been the philosophical inspiration for my work." What did you mean by that, or what do you mean by that?
Oh, so much that it would be difficult to say. But,
All right, make a beginning.
Camus is a writer who speaks not an esoteric language, but speaks directly out of his own experience to others who share that experience. And he's a person who has come to consciousness in the 20th century and is profoundly sensitive to the problems which, pervade the 20th century. Problems of war, problems of extermination camps, problems of the death of God or the transformations in religion, the whole Industrial Revolution, and the whole question of what is the meaning of life in a world undergoing such rapid and comprehensive transformation. And Camus speaks to us, and to me very personally, on those issues. And as I go around and as I have spoken or talked about Camus, it's remarkable how many people have had a similar kind of response, and he has spoken to in that way.
Well, now, for those in our audience who might not know about Albert Camus, suppose you tell us who he was and perhaps something about his life.
Well, very briefly, he was a French Algerian, born in about 1913. He died in 1960. He died in an automobile crash, very tragically. Some said appropriately, since he was associated with the notion of the absurd, and they thought that he has an absurd death that seemed appropriate.
What a way to go, yeah.
Less appropriate the more you know about him, but in fact he didn't like fast cars and he was not driving. Like had a ticket for the train that he was supposed to be taking back to Paris in his pocket. He won the Nobel Prize in 1957, the second youngest person ever to do so, a few months older than Rudyard Kipling, for, I could say, the Nobel Prize Committee refers to it, and I think that it's a nice little expression that they use. They said he won the Nobel Prize for his important literary production, which with clear-sighted earnestness illuminates the problems of the human conscience in our times. And I think that does say a little bit about what he was involved in. He was a French Algerian, so he was from, in some sense, the third world, the periphery.
A little bit on the outside.
Exactly. Marginal figure in that way toward European culture and civilization. Profoundly sensitive to European culture, also somewhat critical of it, and of course being a French Algerian in a time in which Algerian uprisings were emerging, and he was a spokesperson for Algerian rights within French colonial situation, but he was never in favor of Algerian independence. So he found himself in a very ambiguous position as Algerian independence came to the fore in the late 50s and early 60s.
But he was a philosophical thinker, but he also was a wonderful novelist and playwright, so tell us about that.
Right. Well, he's a stylist of the first order. I mean, and I can't do justice to the beauty of his language, both in lyrical essays, such as Nuptials, or Two Sides of the Coin, and of the novels for which he became famous. The Stranger, which is read almost invariably in literary courses in high schools and colleges across the country, or The Plague, which in a very important way captured the experience of wartime France in a kind of mythological form in 1947. And then, of course, the essays such as The Myth of Sisyphus, which tried to address the meaning of life in a world without God, or in which the belief in God is highly dubious, and The Rebel, which was his major philosophical essay. And The Rebel tries to address the question of how can one fight for human liberation and human dignity without becoming in oneself an instrument of oppression and totalitarian enslavement.
Wow. Very interesting, very, really very thoughtful subjects.
Yeah. Well, the latter concern was one in which he was well ahead of his time, because he was most operative during World War II and the post-war period into the Cold War, and he was totally critical of the Soviet or communist camp, but totally dissatisfied with the lack of humanism in the Western camp. But there was no third camp at the time, and he was, as it was, struggling to find a way, of a third way, as it were.
Place.
He would
Yeah.
perhaps be a little more at home today than he would have been then.
Yeah, yeah. Well, he would be astonished, as I think everybody is, at
Yeah.
what's happening in the world now. My gosh. Your interest in Camus began in college, you said, at
Right.
about the time he won the Nobel Prize.
Right.
And as you mentioned, shortly thereafter was killed in a car crash. But you mentioned when we spoke the relevance of Jack Newfield's book on Robert Kennedy,
Right.
and how that also got your
Right.
motor going on this subject. Would you elaborate on that?
Well, it's actually, it's not so much that I got going from the Kennedy thing, but I think Robert Kennedy found in Camus the kind of personal tone and deep responsiveness to his own suffering after the death of his brother. So Newfield talks about how Robert Kennedy found Camus and his works after his brother's death, and read everything of Camus, and said that really without Camus, the reading of Camus and Camus' assistance, he would not have been able to survive that tragedy. Camus gave him a sense of life and its possibilities as well as its limitations, and somehow struck a profoundly responsive chord.
Well, that's really very interesting, because the Kennedys had another thing. They all had very strong religious faith, which one might think would sustain them at such a time. But Camus seems to have been a very important force. I find that very, very interesting.
The thing, if I could add one thing, the thing that I have found numerously, in numerous talks and presentations, is that that's not a unique case. The number of people who have come up to me and talked about the personal impact that Camus has had on their life is legend.
Yeah.
And it's so he's not, he's a writer, he's a philosopher, but he's not an abstract thinker. I mean, he is someone who does touch people in strange and deep ways.
Yeah. Am I correct in assuming that he was much more with us during the 60s and the 70s, perhaps, than he is today? I mean,
As a popular figure?
Yes, as a popular figure.
I think that is absolutely true. Even less so in the 70s, much more in the 60s. In the 40s and 50s in Europe, and then as a phenomena in America, and in the 60s, the whole new left generation was, to some extent, at least the early part of it, schooled on Camus.
Well, let us hope that we'll come around. I have a saying, a profound saying, which is that good is good.
Yeah.
That's pretty profound.
Right.
But it's true. I mean,
Yeah.
things that are good, that have relevance, that speak to us, do come around again. They really do.
Yeah.
Now, I know you did a lot of research on this book. Do you...
25 years.
25 years. Oh, that's a lot. Do you speak French? Did you do your research in French?
Yes, I'd rather not have to speak French in public, but yes, I do to some extent.
Enough to do.
I've done some of the translations of it, and I'm in the process of doing more translations of some of the work that Camus has done. Yeah.
I always think of the wonderful example of I.F. Stone, who at the age of, 75, decided to study Greek so that he could write about Sophocles.
I met him, actually. I had the good fortune of having dinner with him in Washington, D.C. A friend of mine had got him a position at American University as a I don't know, what was distinguished fellow or some sort. And he would walk 2.5 miles to work to this university every day, carrying his little Greek cards and studying them at the age of 75. He's a remarkable human being. And his book is really quite interesting on Socrates. It's remarkable.
I had read The Exile and the Kingdom, which I just adore. I think they're wonderful stories, and The Stranger, and found both books fascinating. And you have mentioned that he was born in Algeria. In other ways, you've talked about philosophically and politically where he found himself. Do you think that whole fact that he was born in Algeria influenced his writing in other ways?
Oh yeah, tremendously. He has a tremendous sense of the body and of nature and the role of climate. In fact, in all of his writings, in a certain sense, climate sets the experiential mood, and the story takes place sort of enveloped in a certain climate. And as the climate changes, the moods changes of the characters.
Well, it's certainly true in the Exile and the Kingdom. In the Adulterous Woman is the story that I do in one of my programs, and that is so extraordinary in the feeling of the desert and the sand and the Bedouins, and I mean the whole thing is just it's just a remarkable story.
As you read that, you almost feel the sand coming into your cheeks.
You feel it all over you.
Yeah.
It's just remarkable, and every part of it. It's really a wonderful story. That's kind of what got me interested, you know.
Yeah.
We think of him as one of the leading existential writers of the post-World War II era, with Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. Were they close philosophically? Were they close, you know, personally?
It's a very complicated story.
Well,
And
see
the
if you
answer
can
is yes
simplify it.
and no. He was identified in the public mind with existentialism, and Sartre and Camus were seen as like two peas of a pod, or brothers, or common thought. They used to joke among themselves that one day they were going to take out a little advertisement in the newspaper saying any similarity between their thought is purely coincidental. They were very close and friendly at the end of the post-war period, and for about 5 years, from about 43 to 50 roughly. But they were very different in important ways in philosophy, and some very different character and types. So the basis of their disagreements was in some sense rooted early on, before they even knew one another. And they had a very famous and devastating break, as it were, in their relations in 1951, shortly after the publishing of Camus' book, The Rebel, and they never spoke again.
And what happened? I mean, what?
Well, basically, Camus wrote a book called The Rebel, which is an analysis of political thought, which was a criticism of the Marxist or communist left, as well as it was a critique of what you might call the bourgeois right. Sartre at that time had decided that in the Cold War atmosphere there were two camps, the Soviet camp and the American camp, and he was against the American camp, so if it was necessary, it was the Soviet camp which expressed the interest of the working class. So he was not sympathetic to Camus' efforts to find a humanistic third way. And Sartre's journal, Modern Times, named after Charlie Chaplin's movie, about 6 months after Camus' book was published, did a very scathing criticism, book review of Camus. Camus felt it was a betrayal. He did not expect, he expected perhaps criticism, but not the scathing attack which it was. He thought it was disloyal and as well as incorrect. And so, of course, he responded, and Sartre responded, and there was a public furor, which in France, when intellectuals like that have a furor,
yes,
it plays a much,
big
it's all
stuff.
over the pages, or front pages, and they never spoke again. Camus never forgave Sartre for that. And it was profoundly upsetting. You can see traces of the significance of that disturbance in Camus' novel The Fall, which comes out several years later, which is a very brilliant, beautifully written, but deeply obscure book, which reflects on the guilty conscience of the modern time in some sense. And it really is in some sense an attack at Sartre and the existentialists.
Well, it's interesting because in a recent book on Simone de Beauvoir, she kind of makes light of him. You know, really, she kind of characterizes him as a lightweight, which you know, doesn't mean that that's the case at all. But but you know,
I think Sartre had a similar thing. Sartre had a similar feeling. Sartre, who was anything but a lightweight intellectually, did not, I think, take Camus seriously intellectually. I don't think he appreciated what Camus had to say, and I don't think he did him justice. But Sartre is a genius. He certainly was, and they did not think seriously of Camus.
You stress the importance of Camus to contemporary life. Beyond what you've said, what does he say? How does he speak to us?
Well, in the first way, there's a series of anxieties and uncertainties that human beings, I think, experience, and the more intelligent people, about what it means to live in a world which is undergoing such rapid transformation, in which religion, you know, ancient religions are at least uncertain of their meaning and their role in a world of modern science, industrialization, a global economy, and an infinite universe. So those kind of anxieties about the meaning of life, the possibility of human existence, the whole question of personal identity, Camus really addresses those in a profoundly meaningful way, and I think continues to speak to human beings at that level. He helps us address our anxieties honestly and directly, and to face them. He doesn't resolve them, he doesn't solve them, but he helps us address them. I think that's what Robert Kennedy found. That's at the sort of metaphysical level. At the more mundane, quote-unquote, political and social level, he talks about what it means to have community, and the role, the possibilities and the limitations of human community as a way of addressing, you might say, our cosmic alienation, our cosmic loneliness. I mean, this whole question of what, you know, the species on a little planet in an infinite universe. He talks about community, what that involves, and what its limitations are and what its problems are. And he links that social vision to a question about the conditions of human dignity. And he has, so he addresses the political world. Sartre talks about him in a very moving obituary that Sartre did write about Camus. He said, I can give you that quote.
Please, no,
It's
that's
a very moving little quote. And he said, Camus' obstinate humanism, narrow and pure, austere and sensual, waged an uncertain war against the massive and formless events of the time. But on the other hand, through his dogged rejections, he reaffirmed, at the heart of our epoch, against the Machiavellians and against the idol of realism, the existence of the moral issue. In a way, he was that resolute affirmation. Anyone who read or reflected encountered the human values he held in his fist. He questioned the political act. In an age in which politics can be so comprehensive, so all-consuming, so absolutely inescapable, and at the same time so oppressive, Camus really gives us a sensitivity and a direction, right, which it was difficult to articulate and to be heard at the time of the Cold War. It becomes now perhaps more possible and more necessary to hear his words and to meditate upon them, not necessarily to take them as an answer, but to think about them.
Oh, it's interesting. And in addition to which, he was superbly gifted as a writer.
Yes.
You know, the
right.
ability to not just to say what you have said, but to embrace that in fiction. You know,
Right.
to really to write so wonderfully.
He talks about bringing myths to life. That's his phrase. And I think that's, if we understand by myth, not a fanciful story that you tell children or something that that people long ago believed, but if you talk about myth as kind of the dramatic themes of our own life, right? The way Joseph Campbell would talk about them, when he talks about the myths to live by. Camus sought to address and dramatize the myths by which we live. And the titles, you think of some of the titles, and you can see the mythic dimension: the fall, the plague,
The stranger.
the stranger, exile, and the kingdom.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
I mean, in some sense, we're all living in degrees of exile.
Right.
Being cut off from kind of historical roots and our cultural home. Where is the extended family?
Yeah.
Where is the extended culture? Where is the religious traditions and the ethnic traditions to which we make
That's
appeal?
right. Which-
So we're all in some sense,
Which
you know,
gave
off on
us
our
a
own.
home, which
Yeah.
gave us a
Right.
base.
The other side is our individualism. In some sense, is the other side of our rootlessness.
Yeah, yeah.
And we're all looking for, whether it be love or salvation, or you know, or the
Whatever.
beloved kingdom,
Yeah,
or some
whatever.
home.
Yeah. Oh,
So
that's really,
Camus takes those themes
it's
and he
really-
dramatizes
it's
them.
really interesting. David, I would love to have you read something from the book. I wonder if you would do that for us. Would
Okay,
you?
well, I have a very brief passage, otherwise we
Okay,
can
okay.
bore people to death.
No, no.
But this
we're
is a
not gonna do
little
that.
beginning, it gives a little sense of Camus and a little sense of the way I write about it. It doesn't do justice to Camus' own writing. In the beginning of the book, I note about him. A French Algerian, born and raised in the sun-bathed and impoverished working-class districts of North Africa, Camus' relation to European civilization was deeply ambivalent. His thinking was profoundly European, tormented by problems inherited through several thousand years of Judeo-Christian history, but his physical sensibilities were pagan, that is, Greco-Roman, rooted in the sensual vitality of a body immersed in the sun, sand, and sea of the Mediterranean shore. Half in and half out of European civilization, he experienced both sides of the coin. He knew the strengths and weaknesses, the possibilities and disasters, the grandeur and vulgarities of the European civilization with which he felt total solidarity. He was at one with it in its struggle for survival against the forces of nihilism, emerging with powerful destructive force in the fascist movements of the 30s and 40s. And he experienced the vitality, the force for renewal, that was the offering of a guilt-free body at grips with the beauties of nature, which he felt was emerging on the shores of North Africa, on the margins of European civilization. As his exile was double, forced both by natural and social events out of a union with the North African world, and by the movement of European history out of the ultimate meaningfulness that had been its Judeo-Christian promise, so his need for the resurrection of the kingdom was more poignant and deeply felt. The challenge of his life was to find a path out of this desert of alienation, desiccation, and dehumanization toward a renaissance in human living and to give preliminary form to such a renaissance. That's sort of a
Very,
brief summary.
yes, really very interesting. And you talk about the sand and the sun and the sea, and he really uses that, you know, in everything. So you're mentioning that
Right.
that was so, you know, indigenous to his person. That was really part of what he brought.
Right.
It's remarkable. How did your book, Camus, A Critical Examination, begin? What moved you to write the book? I mean, you've said 25 years.
Well,
you've lived with it, but what really moved you to write the book?
There are at least two themes, two strands to that.
Okay.
One is very prosaic. I had to write a dissertation to get a
of
PhD,
course,
so I had to choose something. And I was originally going to write about Hegel. Anybody who knows anything about philosophy knows that you get into Hegel, it's like falling into an abyss. You never get out. So fortunately, I was saved from that abyss. Camus was not that. But the other thing was all of the meaningfulness of Camus to me.
To you, it really
And
spoke.
it spoke to me.
It
I had to
spoke to you.
convince my philosophy mentors at Penn State, where I was doing my graduate work, that it was a legitimate topic for philosophy, because he obviously was known as a literary. He was obviously an important literary figure. A lot of philosophers did not take him, still do not take him adequately seriously. Sartre was not the only one. I think they're incorrect in that, but I had to convince them that it was a legitimate topic for philosophy.
Have you written other books?
Yes, right. A book called The Drama of Thought, which is subtitled An Inquiry into the Place of Philosophy in Human Experience, which came out of my teaching at C.W. Post College. And I was trying to explain to undergraduate students what is the meaningfulness of philosophy, what is its potential relevance to them, and why should they spend any time, you know, studying it. And out of that, I then tried to develop you know, try to write it out in theoretical form.
Okay. You teach a course in the philosophy department at C.W. Post on contemporary social issues.
Right.
Now, what does that mean?
Well, I teach many of those courses, I must say. Basically, it's an effort to try and help students think about their modern world in a meaningful and in a little more sophisticated way. So I try to choose issues which seem to me to be relevant to them. I mean, and there's some dialogue as a give and take, and I try to involve them in them, in these issues. In fact, I try to put them in situations in which they have to experience the issues, rather than, so I do not lecture to them. I lecture less and less. And I put them in groups, and I put them in situations where they have to both deal with the issue and deal with the moral and ethical problems that arise between one another. But we consider issues such as crime and problems of crime. We did long discussions and debates on the question of legalization of drugs. That's been a topic which has been the last couple of years. Problems of human relations, problems of gender, male-female relations, and how to, and the changing roles and patterns, the moral issues involved. Questions like that.
Yeah. Oh, but what an interesting way of doing it. Because I think it must be very hard to grab undergraduates, and you know, in terms of contemporary social issues. So if you found a way to do it, I think that's I think it's terrific.
They sink or swim because I put them in groups, and the group is collectively responsible for what they produce.
That's also a very good way of doing it.
Which some people don't like, and some people do like, and some people try to use others in the group, and then somebody comes to me and says, "Well, he's not doing his work," and I said, "Well, what do you want to do about that? It's your group, you know." So we have to deal with the issues of responsibility, and I find that if I'm going to lecture to them, once in a while I'll turn them on. Most of the time they'll be asleep, and they'll switch to another channel. So.
Well, also philosophically, it's a very good thing. I hope that we're beyond the era of the rugged individual. Maybe we'll move in the 90s to where people are thinking more socially, more as a unit, more of their society as a whole than themselves as individuals. I mean, I think we're chronically sick from that right now in our society. I mean, I personally think.
I share that view. And so I actually emphasize, you know, collective
It's
learning
terrific.
and the problems that are involved with it.
It's a super way to go. I approve. I heartily approve. Do you use Camus as a source of study in the course, or would
in
it be
that course,
applicable?
usually not. I do special courses on Camus, and I have on occasion used him. But basically, no, I try to use sources which are somehow more, quote-unquote, directly contemporaneous to their experience,
But
where possible.
Yeah, but do you teach anything? I mean, you have this wonderful reservoir of information and love and enthusiasm. Do you have an opportunity to teach a course on Camus?
On Camus, yes, on occasion, but not that often. I did a seminar on Camus recently for advanced philosophy students, and it was one of the best courses I've had in a long time, and I
Yeah,
enjoyed it.
yeah.
And I use, obviously, the influence that he's had on my life is too pervasive and too relevant not to come through almost everything I do. But I don't usually do it in this course.
Yeah. Well, I just want to read an excerpt from a review of your book. I mean, I think people should know in what high esteem the book is held. The writer says, David Sprintzen offers the first original and comprehensive analysis in English of the thought of Albert Camus from a philosophical perspective. In this 75th year of the philosopher's birth, Sprintzen offers a splendid invitation to join in an intense dialogue concerning human existence and the turbulent civilization in which Camus and his readers raise and attempt to answer questions. So I think that's not bad.
That's pretty nice, yeah. I
Not
like
bad.
that.
Let me ask you, we're running out of time, but it just
Okay.
occurs to me that you are known as a scholar and somebody who's deeply interested. You've written the book. Are there societies, are there places when they study Camus, they look around for somebody to come in and talk about it? Or, I mean, has this book extended your area of expertise? Are you very often called to lecture here or there or wherever?
Very often would be a little extreme. I have
Okay.
been called.
You
I
have
have
been
gone
called.
places to the lecture. I was in Louisville. They say
Mhm.
Louisville when they go down to
Louisville.
university.
Yeah,
Louisville.
Louisville.
I learned how to say it when I was there in Kentucky and elsewhere. But there's an international network of Camus scholars.
That's kind of what I
Right.
meant. And you're
I
zapped
was
into
pleased.
that network.
Well,
yes?
yeah, to some extent. I was pleased. I was looking into one of these computers at Queens College where you can get into the card files of all your libraries, looked into the system, and the book was all through the Florida system. So I said, someone must have ordered it down there.
That's terrific.
But it would benefit much greater if it had reviews in famous places, because otherwise it's very difficult. The number of books that are out, as anyone knows, are
Oh, yeah.
tremendous,
Yeah.
and it's difficult to know how to sort them out.
Yeah.
And many
Yeah.
of them are very good.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Who are we're rapidly running out of time, but who are the writers who have been most influenced by Camus? Can you?
writers most influenced by Camus? That's a difficult
Is it
question for me
hard?
to answer. I mean, in a certain sense, the entire post-war generation
Has been
is profoundly influenced by Camus. I
Okay.
mean, not just in the European sphere, but in America. He had tremendous
Yeah.
influence on American writers.
Yeah.
Stylistically as well, because he uses a whole series of different styles. But I couldn't say who had been most
Yeah.
influenced by him.
David, you know, we have run out of time, and I wanted to ask you how your work in the Long Island Progressive Coalition has been influenced, but I think you've told us some of that. I think we have some of that. Thank you so much, David. I'd like to put up on the screen the name of your book, because I think people would be interested in seeking it out.
Right.
It's Camus, A Critical Examination by David Sprintzen, published by Temple University Press. Thank you very much, David Sprintzen. I've enjoyed this so much.
Thank you very much, Shirley.
Good evening. I'm Shirley Romaine for Art Scene. See you next time.